Let's look at the B introduction. The B introduction and the A introduction have some significant differences, but mostly the B introduction is just an expanded version of the A introduction. So I'm going to skip over the introduction of the first edition and move immediately to the introduction to the second edition. This consists of Roman numbered paragraphs. So paragraph 1 on the difference between pure and empirical cognitions. I do want to read out the first sentences of this section. There is no doubt whatever that all our cognition begins with experience. For how else should the cognitive faculty be awakened into exercise, if not through objects that stimulate our senses and in part themselves produce representations, in part bring the activity of our understanding into motion to compare these, to connect or separate them, and thus to work up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. As far as time is concerned, then, no cognition in us precedes experience, and with experience every cognition begins. So what Kant is doing here is, first of all, he is talking about the relation between cognition and experience. And of course, the empiricists have been saying that all our knowledge comes from experience. And Kant is going to say that that is not true, but that there is a sense in which all our knowledge begins with experience, because without experience, our mind would really never get started doing anything. But maybe even more importantly than sort of making this distinction that can put the empiricists in their place, is Kant's description of how human cognition actually works, right? What experience actually is. It consists of two things, right? In part, there are these objects that stimulate our senses and themselves produce representations. They produce those representations in part because in part there's also something else needed, the activity of our understanding, which compares, connects, separates, blah blah blah, and works up the raw material of sensible impressions into a cognition of objects that is called experience. So what we see here is that experience for Kant is not the same thing as a sense impression, right? A sense impression is something that comes from the object, but then we are going to do something with it, right? Our mind, our cognitive powers are going to work on it. They're going to connect, separate, compare, and that is going to generate a cognition of objects that is worthy of being called experience. So for just to give an example, if you are lying somewhere, like, I don't know, you've taken some weird drugs and you get just visual, like not really impressions, but like, you know, colors and stuff, it's all just moving in front of your eyes. That's what you're experiencing. That's not what Kant would call experience. Right, that's not what Kant would call experience, unless we've been able to sort of recognize objects in it, link it to objects, turn it into something that is objective, and we're going to see that this involves concepts, and it involves laws and rules and stuff like that. That is not experience. And so experience requires two things, right? It requires the spontaneity of the understanding, which is this conceptual activity, and it requires the receptivity of what Kant calls intuition, which is our direct connection to the objects. Okay, so Kant goes on to say that although all our cognition commences with experience, that doesn't mean that it all arises from experience, and he makes the first of two important distinctions here, the distinction between cognitions a priori and cognitions a posteriori, or as Kant likes to say, empirical. So normally we would say a priori versus a posteriori. Kant generally uses the term empirical for a posteriori, but it means the same thing, right? An a priori cognition is a cognition that can be justified, maybe that's the best way to try to define this, that can be justified without an appeal to any concrete experiences. And an a posteriori or empirical judgment is a judgment that could only be justified by an appeal to concrete experiences. So if I claim that there are 17 cars in my street, that is clearly an empirical claim, right? And I could only justify that by actually having experiences of, these 17 cars, or, having experiences that somehow relate to maybe other people having those experiences or whatever, but I need experience for that. I can't get it through pure reason alone. On the other hand, cognitions a priori are cognitions that don't need experience for their justification. Okay, right, so that's the difference here. And this distinction between the a priori and the empirical is an old distinction, right? It's something that Kant doesn't have to come up with. It's something that's already there in the philosophy of his time as he finds it. Now, by the way, Kant is also going to make a distinction between pure and impure cognitions, which is slightly different. Impure cognitions are cognitions in, well, basically they involve concepts that we could only have gotten from experience. And so when we do a critique of pure reason, we are interested in pure cognitions, pure a priori cognitions, in fact. And they're going to be a priori cognitions that involve only concepts that come from reason itself. And this is something that will become much clearer later on when we get to the part of the book called the analytic. Okay, so that is section 1. So in section 2, Kant is going to give us some marks of the a priori. And he talks about necessity and he talks about universality. And this might strike some of us as odd, because something being necessary and something being universally true are well known not to be the same thing. If something is universally true, like all A's are B's, if you know any contemporary analytic philosophy, you know all the counterexamples that show that that kind of universality is not the same thing as necessity, because it could be the case that, I don't know, all books in my room are in English. They're not, but, suppose that all books in my room are in English. That might be a universal truth in a sense, like it starts with all, but it's not necessary. I could bring a French book in this room, or a Dutch book, or a German book, or a Swahili book, and it would not turn into an English book. Okay, that is not what Kant is talking about, right? When Kant talks about universality, he says, what I mean is strict universality. That is, that no exception at all is allowed to be possible. So this strict universality is basically the same thing as necessity. I mean, Kant talks about 2 marks, but they're basically the same thing, and Kant tells us as much. If any judgment is to be strictly universal, is to be necessary, Kant says, it has to be a priori. It has to be a priori, because experience can show us that something is the case, but it can never show us that something has to be the case. Right? I can see that there are 17 cars in my street, but I can't see that there have to be 17 cars in my street. I mean, how could it show that? And even when we think about things that we think have to be the case, right? If I put my hand in the fire, it hurts, right? But did it have to hurt? Was it necessary for me to feel pain after putting my hand in the fire? Well, Kant is going to suggest that maybe it is necessary, but that's not something that experience, that like the empirical thing alone could ever teach me. I'm going to need some a priori insights to really get to any judgment of necessity or universality. It's also here in section 2 that Kant says, and this is B5, that we really need a priori principles in our cognition. One could establish their indispensability for the possibility of experience itself, thus establish it a priori. For where would experience itself get its certainty if all rules in accordance with which it proceeds were themselves in turn always empirical and thus contingent? And so here Kant is suggesting that the very activity of cognition that generates experience requires a priori rules. It requires rules for how to proceed, which can't come from experience because they are presupposed by all experience. This is, of course, not a real proof here. It's a sort of an indication of the kind of theory, the kind of story that Kant is going to tell. And he gives us some examples. He gives us the example of space, he gives us the example of substance. He says if you try to sort of think away everything that is from experience in your judgments, space is still going to remain, and substance is still going to remain. And again, I don't think that these are supposed to be arguments or proofs. They are sort of indications of the story that Kant is later on going to tell. Because in the transcendental aesthetic, space will turn out to be a priori. And in the transcendental analytic, substance is going to turn out to be a priori. Space is an a priori intuition, substance is an a priori concept, and those are ideas that we will come back to later. Okay, so the a priori is very important for Kant. It is even like super important because, like the thing that we are really interested in most, things like God, freedom, and immortality. If we can know anything about them at all, it seems that we ought to know something about them through like a priori cognition and not in some other way. And so, of course, we always engage in this a priori reasoning, right? We try to understand the world, we try to understand ourselves, we try to understand God, and we use a priori reasoning. And Kant says things may seem to be going pretty well, right? As soon as we go beyond experience, wow, I mean, we seem to make lots and lots of headway, right? We really reach our goals. And of course, Kant is going to argue that to a large extent, all of that is going to be illusory, right? When we are safely within the realm of experience, experience is always there as a check on our theorizing, on our thinking. If we want to say something that is a priori, we had better search for those kinds of a priori truths that still retain a link to experience. Because if we don't do that, if we overleap the boundaries of experience, if we do transcendent stuff, and note that I use the word transcendent and not the word transcendental here. If we try to do transcendent stuff, then we get into a realm where nothing stops us and everything seems to be going well, and we come up with these castles of ideas that really fit together very nicely, and we think that we have the right metaphysics until we meet our neighbor who has a totally different metaphysics and is equally convinced that he is right, and then it turns out that we get into clashes that can never be solved, right? And of course this is the problem of philosophy that Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is supposed to solve. I love at A5, the end of B8, this little metaphor that Kant throws out. The light dove, in free flight, cutting through the air, the resistance of which it feels, could get the idea that it could do even better in airless space. Right? You're a bird, you're flying through the air, it's going kind of well, but the air resistance, right? If only that would be taken away, if only you were in the vacuum, that's where you could really fly. And of course, that's an illusion, and that is precisely the illusion under which traditional metaphysicians labor, according to Kant. They think that if they can get out of the sphere of experience, then they can get to some really important and cool cognitions. Not so, says Kant. So Kant is going to argue that a priori cognition is absolutely possible against the empiricists, like significant a priori cognition. A priori cognition that is contentful, and we're going to learn more about that in section 4. Against the empiricists, he's going to argue that is possible, but against the rationalists, he's going to say that there still has to be this link with experience. And of course, then the burden is on Kant to explain how this is possible, what he is thinking about, and that is what he's going to do. So then we get to 4, on the difference between analytic and synthetic judgments. And this is a distinction that is original to Kant. Right? So the a priori empirical distinction is there in philosophy before Kant. This is what Kant is going to bring like an extra thing to the table, and he thinks it's the key really to understanding the problems that he's going to deal with and the way that he's going to deal with them. So he defines an analytic judgment as, at least affirmative analytic judgments, are those in which the connection of the predicate is thought through identity, but those in which this connection is thought without identity are to be called synthetic judgments. So here Kant is thinking of judgments of the form of A is B. Could be a singular judgment like this cup is hot, right? This cup is hot. Could be a general statement like all dogs are animals, something like that. Those are judgments where there is a subject and there's a predicate. All dogs is the subject and animals is the predicate here. And they can be thought with identity or without identity. With identity here basically means that the predicate is already in the subject. If I think the subject, I already think the predicate. If I think dog, I already think animal. And so when I say that all dogs are animals, I think this with identity. Like the concept of dog is already, the concept of animal is already there inside, in some sense, the concept of dog. But of course, when I say that this cup is hot, I'm not thinking it with identity, because the concept of hotness is not in my concept of the cup, which, among other things, we can see from the fact that this cup can also be cold, and in fact, and to my chagrin, frequently does become cold, although that's not as bad as when it gets empty. Alright, actually, I think a lot of people would agree that Kant's second sort of definition or description of the difference between the analytic and synthetic here is more useful. He says that one could also call the former judgments of clarification and the latter judgments of amplification. And so here we're not necessarily thinking of A is B, could be any kind of judgment. A judgment of clarification sort of just clarifies the concepts, right? It's purely in the realm of the concepts, it just clarifies them. If I say that dogs are animals, I'm just sort of clarifying the concept of dog or maybe the concept of animal to you. On the other hand, there are judgments of amplification. Amplification, they make something more. What do they make more? Our knowledge, our insight, right? They teach us something. They are really substantial. We learn something from them that is not the mere clarification of the concepts that we might already be using. So judgments of clarification are fine, but judgments of amplification are where it's really at. At the very end of this section 4, Kant is going to say that, it's really about what we're really interested in speculative a priori cognition are ampliative principles, right? Those that extend our cognition, those in which we get a really new acquisition. Alright, so judgments of clarification, judgments of amplification, the analytic and the synthetic, and then on the other dimension there's the a priori and the empirical. And so Kant's question now is going to be, which combinations of these things are possible? And so the first thing that Kant tells us is that judgments of experience as such are all synthetic. Any judgment of experience is a judgment that is amplifying, right? That gives us something more. Because experience always gives something to us. It doesn't just clarify my concepts, it gives me something. And so Kant gives us some examples of that. This is pretty uncontroversial. Yeah, I think this is pretty uncontroversial. The idea that anything that is an empirical judgment has to be synthetic is pretty uncontroversial. And okay, if you accept the distinctions, then the idea of an analytic empirical judgment, like a clarification of concepts for which you would need experience, that doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so we can leave that aside. And then the interesting thing are the a priori judgments. Now it's clear that there are a priori analytic judgments. In fact, all analytic judgments have to be a priori. If I'm just clarifying my concepts, I don't need experience to do that. Right? If I know what a dog is and I know what an animal is, then I know that all dogs are animals. That is just sort of drawing out the conceptual connections that are already there. If you want an even clearer example, if I tell you that all triangles have 3 angles, yeah, that is like obvious, right? That's an analytic statement and it's fully a priori. Great. Okay, are there a priori statements that are also synthetic? are there any a priori statements that do not just clarify my concepts, but that actually amplify our knowledge, that extend our cognition? That is going to be Kant's big question here. And he tells us, first of all, that, it's a question that, if you want to claim that, and he does want to claim that, then you immediately have a problem to solve. Because what is not clear is how the different parts of such a judgment are to be related to each other. But if I have an analytic judgment, if I say all dogs are animals, what allows these two parts of the judgment that are on either side of the is, what allows them to be sort of connected, sort of brought together, is just that one of them is already in the other. Right? They don't have to be connected. They already are connected. It's already part of the concept of dog that it's an animal. So all dogs are animals is just making explicit a connection that's already there in the concepts themselves. Okay, when I say this cup is hot, this cup and hot are two concepts that are not connected, like in themselves. So how can I connect them? I can connect them through my experience. Right? There's this, what Kant is going to call an intuition, but let's just say for now an experience. There's this experience that, connects. It's an experience of the cup, it's an experience of hotness, but it's the same experience. Right? It's this experience that I'm having right now, an experience of the hot cup, of the cup being hot. It is the experience that connects the concepts. Okay. But now what about a synthetic cognition a priori? Right? There's no experience there. And it's also not the case that the concepts are contained in each other. In order to get these concepts to be related to each other, I need something that relates them. Right? It can't be a concrete experience, but it needs to be something else to which I can connect both of these concepts in such a way that I can see that, yes, they really do go together. Yes, I can really combine them in my judgment. I'm really justified to do that. And so Kant says here at B13, he says, what is the unknown is X here, on which the understanding depends, when it believes itself to discover beyond the concept of a predicate that is foreign to it, yet which it nevertheless believes to be connected with it. What is this unknown is X? That is going to be the question that Kant needs to answer.